Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the stream. Today we are going to continue with our usual Wednesday poetry, prose, and riddles. Starting with the poetry, the last poem we left off on last week was Ode on Solitude by Alexander Pope. Now, as always, we will begin the poetry by rereading the last poem we looked at, and then we will move on to analysing poetry we haven't seen before. So, I shall begin. Ode on Solitude. Happy the man whose wish and care a few paternal acres bound, content to breathe his native air in his own ground, whose herds with milk, whose fields with bread, whose flocks supply him with attire, whose trees in summer yield him shade, in winter fire. Blessed who can unconcernedly find hours, days, and years slide soft away, in health of body, peace of mind, quiet by day, sound sleep by night, study and ease, together mix sweet recreation and innocence, which most does please with meditation. Thus let me live unseen, unknown, thus unlamented let me die, still from the world and not a stone, tell where I lie. So as I say, that was the last poem we looked at, so we won't spend long analysing it, or at all. We will simply move on. So the next poem is by Sir Walter Raleigh. Sir Walter Raleigh, also spelled, was an English statesman, soldier, writer, explorer, and favourite courtier. I think I'm pronouncing that wrong. Explorer and favourite courtier of the English Queen Elizabeth I, one of the most notable figures of the Elizabethan era. He played a leading part in the English colonisation of North America, suppressed rebellion in Ireland, helped defend England against the Spanish Armada, and held political positions under Elizabeth I. I assume this is the same Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh's poetry is written in relatively straightforward, unornamented mode known as the plain style. C.S. Lewis considered Raleigh one of the era's silver poets, a group of writers who resisted the Italian Renaissance influences of dense classical references and elaborate poetic devices. His writing contains strong personal treatments of themes such as love, loss, beauty, and time. Most of his poems are short lyrics or inspired by actual events. In poems such as What is Our Life and The Lie, Raleigh expresses a contemptus mundi, contempt of the world, attitude more characteristic of the Middle Ages than of the dawning era of humanistic optimism. But his lesser-known long poem, The Ocean's Love to Cynthia, combines this vein with the more elaborate conceits associated with his contemporaries Edmund Spenser and John Donne. Expressing a melancholy sense of history, the poem was written during his imprisonment in the Tower of London. Raleigh wrote a poetic response to Christopher Marlowe's A Passionate Shepherd to His Love of 1592, entitled The Nymph's Reply to the Shepherd. Both were written in the style of traditional pastoral poetry and follow the structure of 6 4-line stanzas employing a rhyme scheme of AABB, so in other words rhyming couplets, with Raleigh's an almost line-for-line refutation of Marlowe's sentiments. Years later, the 20th century poet William Carlos Williams would join the poetic argument with his Raleigh was right. The poem we are looking at is called The Night Before His Death. Which I must say I don't see here. I would be surprised if there was another Sir Walter Raleigh, though. We can find no record of it. It's possible it's under the wrong name, or there may be some other mistake, I'm not sure. Anyway, Sir Walter Raleigh, the famous Sir Walter Raleigh, which as Wikipedia says was the favourite courtier of Elizabeth I for a long time. Then he fell into a bad books, and I think he was executed in the end. Yes. Raleigh returned to England, and to appease the Spanish, he was arrested and executed in 1618. Yeah, and he was a poet, it would seem. So, the night before his death. Even such is time that takes on trust our youth, our joys, our all we have, and pays us but with age and dust, who in the dark and silent grave, when we have wandered all our ways, shuts up the story of our days. But from this earth, this grave, this dust, the Lord shall raise me up, I trust. Interesting. I don't notice any words I don't recognise. To be honest, if the thing that's perhaps most remarkable is the fact that the English of what is supposedly an Elizabethan poem is just so clear. Though it does say it's the 1829 edition, which would have been at least 200 years later. In fact, more than that, because he died in 1618. So it's possible that in whatever the 1829 edition was, they modernised the English a bit. The rhyme scheme starts as an ABAB, but then goes to an AABB scheme. It's interesting that the words trust and dust occur twice, but I don't recognise it as being indicative of any grander structure. It's not like we have repeated lines or anything like that. So, meter. quite a lot of it is iambic. There's a fair amount of trochaic substitution at the start. For example, but from this earth, this grave, this dust. There's a clear trochaic substitution at the start there. But the final line is purely iambic. The Lord shall raise me up, I trust. But the first line doesn't figure. Even such as time. Even such as time that takes on trust. I mean, it's 9 syllables, isn't it? Which doesn't help. But I think it's clear that that there should be emphasis placed on takes and on trust. It's clearly not even, such as, time that, takes on, trust. That would be ridiculous. Perhaps such is supposed to be 2 weak syllables. But that would seem to... what's the word? That would seem to... contravene the normal contravene the normal rules of an iambic meter. Even, such as time that takes on trust. Let's see, even. Yeah, the emphasis should be on the first syllable, shouldn't it? Which is indicative of trochaic substitution. Even such as time that takes on trust. So perhaps it's actually relying on the fact that what we effectively have here is 3 weak syllables in a row, I believe, unless I've made a mistake. We've got the N, the and such, and is. And then time should be stressed. So perhaps in the way that you can have... you can end up with 3 consecutive weak syllables in iambic poetry. That will happen if you have a Pyrrhic substitution. This is not a Pyrrhic substitution, but I wonder if it's relying on it sounding very similar to a Pyrrhic substitution, that he's trying to get away with having the he's trying to disguise the fact that the syllable counts don't quite add up. Because is time is an iamb. And such is... yes, I think it's a trochaic substitution, but he's treating the N as though it's also part of a Pyrrhic foot, simultaneously overlapping, which isn't allowed, but I think that might be what's going on here, unless I've misunderstood. I think it's a trick of the ear to get away with being able to muddle the meter. That's the only way it makes sense to me, anyway. I think I've dwelled long enough on that, though. As far as rhyme is concerned, we've got an A, B, A, B, A, B, B. And as far as meter is concerned, it looks like it's iambic, although with some interesting peculiarities. As for meaning, I mean, it really just does seem to be a fairly bland reflection on death for a Elizabethan Christian, really. The first 6 verses are talking about how unfaithful time is, that we trust to it our youth, our joys, and all that we have, and it repays us with death. And then the final 2 lines say, essentially, but that's alright, because the Lord will raise me up. So I think that's about everything that we can say about this particular poem, or at least all that I can think of. If there's anything anyone would like to discuss about it, please leave a comment in chat. And after I have completed my final reading of this poem, which I'm about to do, I will check to see if there's any questions or points for discussion, that sort of thing. Even such is time that takes on trust, our youth, our joys are all we have, and pays us but with age and dust, who in the dark and silent grave, when we have wandered all our ways, shuts up the story of our days. But from this earth, this grave, this dust, the Lord shall raise me up, I trust. Okay, moving on. Samuel Rogers. Samuel Rogers was an English poet. During his lifetime, one of the most celebrated, although his fame has long since been eclipsed by his romantic colleagues and friends, Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Byron. His recollections of these and other friends, such as Charles James Fox, are key sources for information about London artistic and literary life, with which he was intimate, and which he used his wealth to support. He made his money as a banker and was also a discriminating art collector. Early life and family. Rogers was born at Newington Green, then a village north of Islington, and now in inner London. His father, Thomas Rogers, a banker and briefly MP for Coventry, was the son of a Stourbridge glass manufacturer, who was also a merchant in Cheapside. Thomas married Mary, the only daughter of his father's partner, Daniel Radford, becoming himself a partner shortly afterwards. On his mother's side, Samuel Rogers was connected with the well-known Welsh dissenting clergyman Philip Henry and his son Matthew. Was brought up in nonconformist circles and became a long-standing member of the Unitarian congregation at Newington Green, then led by the remarkable Dr. Richard Price, who was educated in Hackney and Stoke Newington. 2 nephews, orphaned young and for whom he assumed responsibility, were Samuel Sharp, the Egyptologist and translator of the Bible, and his younger brother Daniel, the early geologist. The young man. Samuel Rogers wished to enter the Presbyterian ministry. His father persuaded him to join the banking business in Cornhill. In long holidays, necessitated by delicate health, Rogers became interested in English literature, particularly the work of Samuel Johnson, Thomas Gray, and Oliver Goldsmith. He learned Gray's poems by heart, and his family wealth allowed him to leisure to try writing poetry himself. He began with contributions to the Gentleman's Magazine, and in 1786 he published a volume containing some imitation of Goldsmith and an ode to superstition in the style of Gray. Hold on, I should double check his years. Oh, goodness. So he was born in 1763 but died in 1855. So he would have been, what, 92? Yes, 92. He would have seen quite a sizable chunk of history then. Goodness. '63. Just for my own curiosity, when was the first French Revolution? Because there were, in fact, multiple French revolutions. Okay, began in 1789. That's about when I would have expected. So yeah, he was already an adult before the very beginnings of the French Revolution, and then he would have seen all the way through the he would have seen the entirety of the Napoleonic Wars, and finally would have died a Victorian. And I don't think it would have been for that short a period either. No. Queen Victoria took the throne in 1837. So about 18 years he was a Victorian. It's indeed a lot of history. Anyway, I will continue. The young man. So the last thing he's done is published a volume containing some imitations of Goldsmith and an ode to superstition in the style of Gray. In 1788, his brother Thomas died, and Samuel's business responsibilities were increased. In the next year, he paid a visit to Scotland, where he met Adam Smith, Henry Mackenzie, Hester Thrall, and others. In 1791, he was in Paris and enjoyed the Orleans collection of arts at the Palais Royal, many of the treasures of which were later to pass into his possession. With Gray as his model, Rogers took great pains in polishing his verses, and 6 years elapsed after the publication of his first volume before he printed his elaborate poem on the pleasures of memory, regarded by some as the last embodiment of the poetic diction of the 18th century. Interesting. I wonder what they mean by poetic diction. The theory of evaluating and refining familiar themes by abstract treatment and lofty imagery is taken to extremes. In this art of raising a subject, as the 18th century phrase was, the pleasures of memory is much more perfect than Thomas Campbell's Pleasures of Hope, published a few years later in imitation. Byron said of it, "There is not a vulgar line in the poem." Interesting. I noticed no citation for that, but interesting. Yeah, I'll probably stop reading there. I don't particularly like to read through the entirety of a Wikipedia article. That's not really what we're here for, but I do like to get a sense of who somebody was. Hopefully that's enough, for now anyway, and we may be able to read some additional meaning into his poetry, or at least place it in its proper context. So, a wish. Mine be a cot beside the hill, a beehive's hum shall soothe my ear, A willowy brook that turns a mill, with many a full shall linger near. The shallow, oft beneath my thatch, shall twitter from her clay-built nest. Oft shall the pilgrim lift the latch, and share my meal, a welcome guest. Around my ivied porch shall spring each fragrant flower that drinks the dew, and Lucy at her will shall sing, in russet gown and apron blue. The village church among the trees, where first our marriage vows were given, with merry peals shall swell the breeze, and point with taper spire to heaven. Now, we read on the Wikipedia article that... Oh, sorry, Thomas married Mary. Who was Thomas? Oh, his father. I'm just wondering who, if anyone, Samuel Rogers married. Whether they were actually called Lucy or not. It doesn't say here that he married. Interesting. Yeah, there's no reference to a Lucy. So presumably the poem is written from the point of view of someone other than the writer. Other than the author, I should say. Now what's he mean by a cot beside the hill? Oh, as in a cottage? Is that a shortening? Is that a shortening that was used? Cottage or small homestead. So yes, that seems likely. So I think it's generally praising the simple life. Are there any other words that need looking up? I don't think I see any other words that I'm having difficulty with. If there's any words that anyone else would like looked up or discussed, please post about it in chat, and we shall do so. So next we should look at rhyme and rhythm. It's quite simply cross-rhymed, it would seem. A, B, A, B. Simple enough. As for meter, looks iambic to me. There's a few lines that are a bit tricky to render into iambs. Shall twitter from her clay-built nest. Yes, because I feel like... Because if it's iambic, that would mean you'd want to put the stress on from and have a weak her. But I think in natural English it would be the other way round. You would tend to want to stress her because that's the... That's identifying a indirect object in the sentence, whereas from is just a what's the word? A preposition. But largely this all figures with being iambic. In russet gown and apron blue. Yeah, that's all iambic. How many? Do we have a consistent number of syllables? Yep, looks like it's... Well, I obviously haven't read every verse in that time, but it looks to me like it's iambic tetrameter. Yep, so I think that's about everything to say about it, isn't it? We've looked at the words, we've looked at the meter, we've looked at the rhyme, and we've looked at the meaning. So, I guess I'll head on to the final reading. If there's anything else you'd like to discuss about this poem, please post about it in chat, and after I've finished the final reading, I will address anything anyone has said. Mine be a cot beside the hill, a beehive's hum shall soothe my ear, a willowy brook that turns a mill, with many a fool shall linger near. The swallow oft beneath my thatch shall twitter from her clay-built nest, oft shall the pilgrim lift the latch, and share my meal, a welcome guest. Round my ivied porch shall spring each fragrant flower that drinks her dew, and Lucy at her wheel shall sing, in russet gown and apron blue. The village church among the trees, where first her marriage vows were given, with merry peals shall swell the breeze, and point with taper spire to heaven. One thing I notice actually on rereading it is it refers to a pilgrim as a welcome guest. I wonder how many pilgrims there actually were at this point. Given this says it's the 1846 edition, I'm guessing this was probably a poem he wrote later in life, during the Victorian era. Whereas I think of pilgrims as more being a medieval thing in England. I don't know for a fact that's wrong, but it does make me strongly suspect that this is a very... what's the word? A very... This isn't grounded in reality so much it is in people's rose-tinted view of rural life, especially in the in history, especially in the past. Could be wrong. Goodness me, William Shakespeare. I'm sure there's no need for me to do much of an introduction for him, so we may as well get into it. So, sonnets, starting with Sonnet 17. Who will believe my verse in time to come? If if it were filled with your most high deserts, though yet heaven knows it is but as a tomb, which hides your life and shows not half your parts. If I could write the beauty of your eyes, and in fresh numbers number all your graces, the age to come would say the poet lies, such heavenly touches never touched earthly faces. So should my papers, yellowed with their age, be scorned like old men of less truth than tongue, and your true rights be termed a poet's rage, and stretched metre of an antique song, but were some child of yours alive that time, you should live twice, in it and in my rhyme. It is an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, at the surface level, it deals with the nature of historical sources as well as straightforwardly the positive attributes of the object of the poem, although it is very notable that I don't think anywhere does he actually explicitly state what is so wonderful about this person. The poem just takes it as granted that they have many, many graces. Certainly a very meta way of writing, which is interesting, because it's almost a poem about writing poetry. What have we got here? We've got... It's cross-rhymed most of the way through until the final two lines, which rhyme together. Although, I would point out that some of these rhymes don't work, and I can only assume that's due to changes in pronunciation. I don't know that for a fact, but it seems likely. So desserts and parts don't rhyme in modern English, and neither do tongue and song. But the other end words do seem to rhyme, as you'd expect. I think it's quite obviously iambic. I don't think much more needs to be said on that point. What about line length? Seems to be iambic pentameter. So that was easy. Yep. Seems to be iambic pentameter, cross-rhymed, with the exception that the final two lines rhyme. They form a rhyming couplet. I think that's everything. I don't think there are any words I had to look up. If there's any words that anyone in chat would like discussed, leave a comment. We've discussed the meter, we've discussed the rhyme, and we've discussed the meaning. So I'll move on to the final reading. As always, if there's anything else you'd like discussed about this poem, please leave a comment and I will look at it after I have completed the final reading. So, Sonnet 17. Who will believe my verse in time to come, if it were filled with your most high desire... Sorry, I'll start again. Who will believe my verse in time to come, if it were filled with your most high deserts? Wait, that's not deserts, that's deserts. But that makes no sense. I'm not going mad, am I? Oh, that's interesting. That is really interesting. I didn't know that. So obviously desert has the meaning a barren area of land, but apparently, usually in the plural, that which is deserved or merited, or just punishment or reward, as in just deserts, often confused with desert, which is exactly the confusion I made just then. I mean, that confusion is made even easier by the fact that it's pronounced dessert, like the thing you would eat after your main course. Whereas if we were talking about the barren place, we would say desert. The emphasis is different. So it's pronounced like dessert, but it's spelt like desert. Ah, I never knew that. Oh, and it comes from Vulgar Latin, which I can't pronounce, but deservio or something like that. Oh, as in deserve. Oh, to gain on merit by giving service. Ah. That makes sense. Okay, didn't know that. I do now. Sorry about that. I know I was supposed to be doing the final reading, but that confused me. Who will believe my verse in time to come, if it were filled with your most high deserts? Though yet heaven knows it is but as a tomb, which hides your life and shows not half your parts. If I could write the beauty of your eyes, and in fresh numbers number all your graces, the age to come would say this poet lies. Such heavenly touches never touched earthly faces. So should my papers, yellowed with their age, be scorned like old men of less truth than tongue, and your true rights be termed a poet's rage, and stretched metre of an antique song? But were some child of yours alive that time, you should live twice in it and in my rhyme. I like this. I'm of course aware of Shakespeare's reputation, but I must say that's quite original and quite technically well done. Well, I say original. I mean, given Shakespeare's reputation, it's probably been copied to a extraordinary degree, and that's ignoring the fact that I don't really know much about Elizabethan poetry. I don't know the context in which this was written, but to me today, this seems original. Next we have Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, which I believe, based on that numbering, must be Sonnet 18, assuming it's still, these numbers are sonnet numbers. This of course a very famous poem by Shakespeare. So, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou grow'st. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So again, we are seeing the theme of writing about someone indirectly by writing about writing poetry. Although this one is a bit more direct in its compliments, especially in the first two lines. First two verses. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Oh, if it's oest, then it would be growest. Even though the apostrophe there suggests it should be grossed. Yet again, we have... Is that right? Yeah, we have 12 cross-rhymed lines, followed by a rhyming couplet. And again, it looks like iambic pentameter, so this is seeming like quite a deliberate form. Oest, I was going to look that up. Person singular simple present form of O. Second person singular. So if I'm not mistaken, that would suggest that historically you wouldn't have said you owe me money, you would have said you owest me money. That makes sense. But why would you say nor lose possession of that fair thou owest? How would you owe being fair? Or, the only way it makes sense to me is if he's suggesting that you owe summer fairness, i.e. beauty. As if your beauty enhances that of summer, and you owe it to summer to be so beautiful, because you're making summer better. That's the only way it makes sense to me, but I feel like I'm probably misunderstanding that. Not sure. Well, we've discussed meter and rhyme, we've discussed words we don't recognise. Although if there are any other words you don't recognise and would like discussed, please leave a comment. I think I've gotten all out of the meaning I'm likely to get, without significantly more research anyway. So, I'll move on to the final reading of this poem. Yet again, if you would like to discuss anything else about this poem, please leave a comment in chat and we shall do so. I shall look at such comments after I've completed the final reading anon. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's least hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So now we have sonnet 30, assuming my assumption about the numbering is correct. When do the sessions? So, oh sorry, when to the sessions? When to the sessions of sweet silent thought, I summon up my apologies. When to the sessions of sweet silent thought, I summon up remembrance of things past. I sighed the lack of many a thing I thought. I do apologise, I don't seem to be able to pronounce this correctly, do I? Let me try once more. When to the sessions of sweet silent thought, I summon up remembrance of things past. I sigh the lack of many a thing I sought, and with old woes new wail my dear time's waste. Then can I drown an eye and used to flow, for precious friends hid in death's dateless night, and weep afresh love's long since cancelled woe, and moan the expense of many a vanished sight. Then can I grieve at grievances forgone, and heavily from woe to woe tell o'er the sad account of fore bemoaned moan, which I knew pay as if not paid before. But if the while I think on thee, dear friend, all losses are restored and sorrows end. So this one seems a little more complex. In meaning, anyway. I think we've still got... Yeah, it still looks like iambic pentameters 12... cross-rhymed verses followed by a rhyming couplet. Yep, all that seems constant or consistent. Yep. So what about meaning? When to the sessions of sweet silent thought, I summon up remembrance of things past. So when I look back on things, I sigh the lack of many a thing I sought, and with old woes new wail my dear time's waste. I think that's saying that when I was younger I was seeking things, and now that I recognise that I still lack those things, my old woes become new, and I am upset about all the wasted time. Then can I drown an eye unused to flow, for precious friends hid in death's dateless night? Can I drown an eye? Is there some other usage of the word I other than the I, or am I misunderstanding something else? The only thing I can think of is He could be using eye to mean something like the mind's eye. But to drown the mind's eye, I assume, would mean to drink heavily, and I really wouldn't want to assume that's what he means there, without knowing the context more fully. And used to flow, no idea what that would be. For precious friends, hid in death's dateless night. Could that mean that many of his friends have died, but that it's been so long that he can't remember the date of their passing? I'm not sure. And weep afresh love's long since cancelled woe. So, lost relationships. Crying over lost relationships, and moan the expense of many a vanished sight. So, the expense of many a vanished sight. So, I don't know, perhaps he's talking about having paid great expense in investing in a relationship which has since ended, and so he no longer has the sight of that individual. Although again, I feel like I may be stretching this too far without being grounded in the proper context. Then can I grieve at grievances forgone, and heavily from woe to woe tell o'er. The sad account of fore bemoaned moan, which I knew pay as if not paid before. So I think again he's reflecting on love lost. This actually makes me slightly more confident that my analysis above may have been correct. So what he's paying is essentially negative emotion, being upset, crying. When he looks back on these things, it feels fresh. But if the while I think on thee, dear friend, all losses are restored and sorrows end. So when I think of a particular person, in this case it's described as being the reader of the poem, although it could of course also be whoever the poem is notionally addressed to, although we don't know who that is. When they think on them, they no longer feel upset anymore. So essentially, it's a poem about looking back on things past, being upset about the fact that they've ended and what it cost them, but then thinking back on more happy memories of a particular friend and no longer feeling sorrowful. That's what it seems to be anyway. So we've looked at rhyme and rhythm, we've looked at meaning. I don't think I noticed any words there. Well, we looked up I, because I wasn't certain about its usage there. But there wasn't a great deal of language there that seemed to cause difficulties. So if there's anything else you'd like discussed about this poem, please leave a comment in chat, and I shall do so after having given the final reading to this poem, when to the sessions. So, when to the sessions of sweet silent thought, I sum up remembrance of things past, I sigh the lack of many a thing I sought, with old woes new wail my dear time's waste. Then can I drown an eye unused to flow, for precious friends hid in death's dateless night, and weep afresh love's long since cancelled woe, and moan the expense of many a vanished sight. Then can I grieve at grievances forgone, and heavily from woe to woe tell o'er the sad account of fore bemoaned moan, which I knew pay as if not paid before. But if the while I think on thee, dear friend, all losses are restored and sorrows end. So, that concludes the poetry for this week. We will now move on to Pride and Prejudice, which we're reaching the end of. I'm not sure exactly how much is left, but I know it's not much. So as always, we will begin by recapping the parts of the novel that we read last week. So, in chapter 55, Mr. Bingley proposes to Jane, who eagerly accepts. The news quickly spreads about Meryton, and the Bennets are pronounced to be the luckiest family in the world, though only a few weeks before, when Lydia had first run away, they had been generally proved to be marked out for misfortune. In chapter 56, Lady Catherine de Bourgh pays a surprise visit to the Bennets in an effort to ascertain whether Elizabeth is engaged to Mr. Darcy, and to put her off any such aspirations regardless. Elizabeth lets it be known that she is not engaged to Mr. Darcy, but obstinately refuses to promise that she would never enter into such an engagement. Elizabeth also reminds Lady Catherine that it is Mr. Darcy who may choose whom he marries, and that her relationship with Mr. Darcy, whatever its nature, is none of her concern. Lady Catherine states that Elizabeth has no regard for the honour and credit of her nephew, and that she is therefore both unfeeling and selfish. Lady Catherine leaves Longbourn greatly dissatisfied. In chapter 57, Mr. Collins writes to Mr. Bennet. In this letter, he makes allusions to Elizabeth's engagement to Mr. Darcy. Mr. Bennet not only finds his proposition so fanciful as to be amusing, but decides to let Elizabeth in on the joke. Elizabeth plays along with this being a joke, but deep down she feels mortified. Something which occurred to me, though, is I'm fairly certain in the letter Mr. Collins writes to Mr. Bennet, he identifies the Lucases as being the source of his information on the Bennet's family's recent change of circumstances, and that then makes me wonder why it is the Lucases believe that Elizabeth is engaged to Mr. Darcy. It's quite possible that we read the reason previously and I've just forgotten. But indeed, off the top of my head, I can't think why the Lucases in particular would have reason to believe there was a relationship there. It was the Gardiners in particular who had begun to suspect something between them, and the Gardiners are a relation of the Bennets. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there. Still, it is what it is. Chapter 58. Instead of receiving any such letter of excuse from his friend, as Elizabeth half expected Mr. Bingley to do, he was able to bring Darcy with him to Longbourn before many days had passed after Lady Catherine's visit. The gentleman arrived early, and before Mrs. Bennet had time to tell him of their having seen his aunt, of which her daughter sat in momentary dread, Bingley, who wanted to be alone with Jane, proposed their all walking out. It was agreed to. Mrs. Bennet was not in the habit of walking. Mary could never spare time, but the remaining 5 set off together. Who would the remaining 5 be? I'm not sure. There are 5 other Bennets. Mr. Bennet, Jane, Elizabeth, but Lydia wouldn't be included in that because she's obviously not there. Who else? Kitty and I'm missing one. Mary. But that doesn't add up to 5 because of Lydia's absence. So perhaps they mean Mr. Bingley, Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth, Jane, and Mary or Kitty. Oh, they said Mary could never spare the time. Okay, so then it must be Kitty. But the remaining 5 set off together. Bingley and Jane, however, soon allowed the others to outstrip them. They lagged behind while Elizabeth, Kitty and Darcy, it is those 5, were to entertain each other. Very little was said by either. Kitty was too much afraid of him to talk. Elizabeth was secretly forming a desperate resolution, and perhaps he might be doing the same. They walked towards the Lucases. Because Kitty wished to call upon Maria, and as Elizabeth saw no occasion for making it a general concern when Kitty left them, she went boldly on with him alone. Now was the moment for a resolution to be executed, and while her courage was high, she immediately said, "Mr. Darcy, I am a very selfish creature, and for the sake of giving relief to my own feelings, care not how much I may be wounding yours, I can no longer help thanking you for your unexampled kindness to my poor sister, ever since I have known it. I have been most anxious to acknowledge to you how grateful I feel it. Were it known to the rest of my family, I should not have merely my own gratitude to express." "I'm sorry, exceedingly sorry," replied Darcy, in a tone of surprise and emotion, "that you have ever been informed of what may, in a mistaken light, have given you uneasiness. I did not think Mrs. Gardiner was so little to be trusted." "You must not blame my aunt. Lydia's thoughtlessness first betrayed to me that you had been concerned in the matter, and of course I could not rest till I knew the particulars. Let me thank you again and again, in the name of all my family, for that generous compassion which induced you to take so much trouble and bear so many mortifications for the sake of discovering them." If you will thank me," he replied, "let it be for yourself alone, that the wish of giving happiness to you might add force to the other inducements which led me on. I shall not attempt to deny, but your family owe me nothing. Much as I respect them, I believe I thought only of you. I meant to say. Elizabeth was too much embarrassed to say a word. After a short pause, her companion added, "You're too generous to trifle with me. If your feelings are still what they were last April, tell me so at once. My affections and wishes are unchanged, but one word from you will silence me on the subject forever." Elizabeth, feeling all the more than common awkwardness and anxiety of his situation, now forced herself to speak, and immediately, though not very fluently, gave him to understand that her sentiments had undergone so material a change since the period to which he alluded as to make her receive with gratitude and pleasure his present assurances. The happiness which this reply produced was much as he had probably never felt before, and he expressed himself on the occasion as sensibly and as warmly as a man violently in love can be supposed to be. Had Elizabeth been able to encounter his eye, she might have seen how well the expression of heartfelt delight diffused over his face became him. But, though she could not look, she could listen, and he told her of feelings which, in proving of what importance she was to him, made his affection every moment more valuable. They walked on, without knowing in what direction. There was too much to be thought and felt and said for attention to any other objects. She soon learnt that they were indebted for their present good understanding to the efforts of his aunt, who did call on him in her return to through London, and there relate her journey to Longbourn. It its motive and the substance of a conversation with Elizabeth, dwelling emphatically on every expression of the latter, which, in her ladyship's apprehension, peculiarly denoted her perverseness and assurance in the belief that such a relation must assist her endeavours to obtain that promise from her nephew which she had refused to give. But unluckily for her ladyship, its effect had been exactly contrariwise. Oh, I see. In the belief that such a relation, that means relating the events of what transpired between Elizabeth and Lady Catherine. Lady Catherine was relating that information to Mr. Darcy, believing that it would assist her endeavours to obtain that promise from her nephew, which she had refused to give, meaning Elizabeth. So hoping that Mr. Darcy would refuse to ever be engaged to her. That makes sense. It taught me to hope, said he, as I had scarcely ever allowed myself to hope before. I knew enough of your disposition to be certain that, had you been absolutely, irrevocably decided against me, you would have acknowledged it to Lady Catherine, frankly and openly. Elizabeth coloured and laughed as she replied, Yes, you know enough of my frankness to believe me capable of that. After abusing you so abominably to your face, I could have no scruple in abusing you to all your relations. What did you say of me that I did not deserve? For though your accusations were ill-founded, formed on mistaken premises, my behaviour to you at the time had merited the severest reproof. It was unpardonable. I cannot think of it without abhorrence. We will not quarrel for the greater share of blame annexed to that evening, said Elizabeth. The conduct of neither, if strictly examined, will be irreproachable, but since then we have both, I hope, improved in civility. I cannot be so easily reconciled to myself. The recollection of what I then said, of my conduct, my manners, my expressions during the whole of it, is now, and has been many months, inexpressibly painful to me. Your reproof, so well applied, I shall never forget. Had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner, those were your words, you know not, you can scarcely conceive, how they have tortured me. Though it was some time, I confess, before I was reasonable enough to allow their justice. I was certainly very far from expecting them to make so strong an impression. I had not the smallest idea of their being ever felt in such a way. I can easily believe it. You thought me then devoid of every proper feeling. I'm sure you did. The turn of your countenance I shall never forget, as you said that I could not have addressed you in any possible way that would induce you to accept me. Oh, do not repeat what I then said. Those recollections will not do at all. I assure you that I have long been most heartily ashamed of it. Darcy mentioned his letter. Did it? Said he. Did it soon make you think better of me? Did you, on reading it, give any credit to its contents? She explained what its effect on her had been, and how gradually all her former prejudices had been removed. I knew, said he, that what I wrote must give you pain, but it was necessary. I hope you have destroyed the letter. There was one part especially, the opening of it, which I should dread you having the power of reading again. I can remember some expressions which might justly make you hate me. The letter shall certainly be burnt, if you believe it essential to the preservation of my regard. But, though we have both reason to think my opinions not entirely unalterable, they are not, I hope, quite so easily changed as that implies. When I wrote that letter, replied Darcy, I believed myself perfectly calm and cool, but I am since convinced that it was written in a dreadful bitterness of spirit. The letter, perhaps, began in bitterness, but it did not end so. The adieu is charity itself. But think no more of the letter. The feelings of the person who wrote and the person who received it are now so widely different from what they were then, that every unpleasant circumstance attending it ought to be forgotten. You must learn some of my philosophy. Think only of the past, as its remembrance gives you pleasure. I cannot give you credit for any philosophy of the kind. Your retrospection must be so totally void of reproach that the contentment arising from them is not of philosophy, but, what is much better, of innocence. But with me it is not so. Painful recollections will intrude which ought not, to be repelled. I have been a selfish being all my life, in practice, though not in principle. As a child I was taught what was right, but I was not taught to correct my temper. I was given good principles, but left to follow them in pride and conceit. Unfortunately, an only son, for many years an only child, I was spoilt by my parents who, though good themselves, my father particularly, all that was benevolent and amiable, allowed, encouraged, almost taught me to be selfish and overbearing, to care for none beyond my own family circle, to think meanly of all the rest of the world, to wish at least to think meanly of their sense and worth compared with my own. Such I was from 8 to 28, and such I might still have been but for you, dearest, loveliest Elizabeth. What do I not owe you? You taught me a lesson, hard indeed at first, but most advantageous. By you I was properly humbled. I came to you without a doubt of my reception. You showed me how insufficient were all my pretensions to please a woman worthy of being pleased. Had you then persuaded yourself that I should? Indeed I had. What will you think of my vanity? I believe you to be wishing, expecting my addresses. My madness must have been in fault, but not intentionally. I assure you, I never meant to deceive you, but my spirits might often lead me wrong. How you must have hated me after that evening. Hate you? I was angry perhaps at first, but my anger soon began to take a proper direction. I was almost afraid of asking what you thought of me when we met at Pemberley. You blamed me for coming. No, indeed, I felt nothing but surprise. Your surprise could not be greater than mine in being noticed by you. My conscience told me that I deserved no extraordinary politeness, and I confess that I did not expect to receive more than my due. My object then, replied Darcy, was to show you by every civility in my power that I was not so mean as to resent the past, and I hoped to obtain your forgiveness, to lessen your ill opinion, by letting you see that your reproofs had been attended to. How soon any other wishes introduced themselves I can hardly tell, but I believe in about half an hour after I had seen you. He then told her of Georgina's delight in her acquaintance, and of her disappointment at its sudden interruption, which naturally leading to the cause of that interruption, she soon learnt that his resolution of following her from Derbyshire in quest of her sister had been formed before he quitted the inn, and that his gravity and thoughtfulness there had arisen from no other struggles than what such a purpose must comprehend. She expressed her gratitude again, but it was too painful a subject to each to be dwelt on farther. After walking several miles in a leisurely manner, and too busy to know anything about it, they found at last, on examining their watches, that it was time to be at home. Ooh, interesting, they both have watches. What could become of Mr. Bingley and Jane was a wonder which introduced a discussion of their affairs. Darcy was delighted with their engagement. His friend had given him the earliest information of it. I must ask whether you were surprised, said Elizabeth. Not at all. When I went away I felt that it would soon happen. That is to say, you had given your permission, I guessed as much, and though he exclaimed at the term, she found that it had been pretty much the case. On the evening before my going to London, said he, I made a confession to him, which I believe I ought to have made long ago. I told him of all that had occurred to make my former interference in his affairs absurd and impertinent. His surprise was great. He had never had the slightest suspicion. I told him, moreover, that I believed myself mistaken in supposing, as I had done, that your sister was indifferent to him. As I could easily perceive that his attachment to her was unabated, I felt no doubt of their happiness together. Elizabeth could not help smiling at his easy manner of directing his friend. "Did you speak from your own observation," said she, "when you told him that my sister loved him, or merely from my information last spring?" "From the former. I had narrowly observed her during the 2 visits which I had lately made here, and I was convinced of her affection. And your assurance of it, I suppose, carried immediate conviction to him." "It did. Bingley is most unaffectedly modest. His diffidence had prevented his depending on his own judgment in so anxious a case, but his reliance on mine made everything easy. I was obliged to confess one thing which for a time, and not unjustly, offended him. I could not allow myself to conceal that your sister had been in town 3 months last winter, that I had known it, and purposely kept it from him. He was angry. His anger, I am persuaded, lasted no longer than I remained in any doubt of your sister's sentiments. He has heartily forgiven me now." Elizabeth longed to observe that Mr. Bingley had been a most delightful friend, so easily guided that his worth was invaluable, but she checked herself. She remembered that he had yet to learn to be laughed at, and it was rather too early to begin. In anticipating the happiness of Bingley, which of course was to be inferior only to his own, he continued the conversation till they reached the house. In the hall they parted. "That's an interesting line, isn't it? She remembered that he had yet to learn to be laughed at, and it was rather too early to begin." Chapter 59. "My dear Lizzie, where can you have been walking to?" was a question which Elizabeth received from Jane as soon as she entered their room, and from all the others when they sat down to table. She had only to say in reply that they had wandered about till she was beyond her own knowledge. She coloured as she spoke, but neither that nor anything else awakened suspicion of the truth. The evening passed quietly, unmarked by anything extraordinary. The acknowledged lovers talked and laughed, the unacknowledged were silent. Darcy was not of the disposition in which happiness overflows in mirth, and Elizabeth, agitated and confused, rather knew that she was happy than felt herself to be so, for, besides the immediate embarrassment, there were other evils before her. She anticipated what would be felt in the family when her situation became known. She was aware that no one liked him but Jane, and even feared that with the others it was a dislike which not all his fortune and consequence might do away. At night she opened her heart to Jane. The suspicion was very far from Miss Bennet's general habits. She was absolutely incredulous here. "You are joking, Lizzie. This cannot be. Engaged to Mr. Darcy? No, you shall not deceive me. I know it to be impossible." "Ooh, that's interesting. I didn't notice that they had formally been engaged. I thought, I had apparently misunderstood that Elizabeth had made it clear that she would be much more receptive to an offer of marriage, but I didn't notice Mr. Darcy offering again. This is a wretched beginning indeed. My sole dependence was on you, and I am sure nobody else will believe me, if you do not. Yet indeed I am in earnest. I speak nothing but the truth. He still loves me, and we are engaged." Hold on, did I genuinely miss that? gave him to understand that her sentiments had undergone so material a change since the period to which he alluded as to make her receive with gratitude and pleasure his present assurances. Yeah, I may be just missing it. I don't see a clear offer of marriage there, but perhaps it's not necessary. Perhaps it is just implicitly obvious that he made an offer of marriage to her, she refused, and then several months later she explains that her feelings have rather changed and that she's very grateful for his affections. Perhaps from that it is considered obvious that she's positively in favour of marriage. I'm not sure. Jane looked at her doubtingly. "Oh, Lizzie, it cannot be. I know how much you dislike him. You know nothing of the matter. That is all to be forgot. Perhaps I did not always love him so well as I do now, but in such cases as these, a good memory is unpardonable. This is the last time I shall ever remember it myself." Miss Bennet still looked all amazement. Elizabeth again, and more seriously, assured her of its truth. "Good heaven, can it be really so? Yet now I must believe you," cried Jane. "My dear, dear Lizzie, I do congratulate you. But you certain? Forgive the question. Are you quite certain that you can be happy with him?" "There can be no doubt of that. It is settled between us already that we are to be the happiest couple in the world. Are you pleased, Jane? Would you like to have such a brother?" "Very, very much. Nothing could give either Bingley or myself more delight. We considered it. We talked of it as impossible. And you really love him quite well enough? Oh, Lizzie, do anything rather than marry without affection. Are you quite sure that you feel what you ought to do?" "Oh, yes. You will only think I feel more than I ought to do when I tell you all." "What do you mean?" "Why, I must confess that I love him better than I do Bingley. I am afraid you will be angry." "My dearest sister, now be serious. I want to talk very seriously. Let me know everything that I am to know without delay. Will you tell me how long you have loved him? It has been coming on so gradually that I hardly know when it began, but I believe I must date it from my first seeing his beautiful grounds at Pemberley." Another entreaty that she would be serious, however, produced the desired effect, and she soon satisfied Jane by her solemn assurances of attachment. When convinced on that article, Miss Bennet had nothing further to wish. "I am quite happy," said she, "for you will be as happy as myself, and I always had a value for him. Were it for nothing but his love of you, I must always have esteemed him. But now, as Bingley's friend and your husband, there can be only one Bingley and yourself more dear to me." "But Lizzie, you have been very sly, very reserved with me. How little did you tell me of what passed at Pemberley and Lambton? I owe all that I know of it to another, not you." "I've quite forgotten the events at Lambton." Oh, Lambton was the name of the village where the gardeners and Elizabeth were staying when they visited Pemberley. Elizabeth told her the motives of her secrecy. She had been unwilling to mention Bingley, and the unsettled state of her own feelings had made her equally avoid the name of his friend. But now she would no longer conceal from her his share in Lydia's marriage. All was acknowledged, and half the night spent in conversation. "Good gracious," cried Mrs. Bennet, as she stood at the window the next morning, "if that disagreeable Mr. Darcy is not coming here again with our dear Bingley! What can he mean by being so tiresome as to be always coming here? I'd no notion but he would go a-shooting, or something or other, and not disturb us with his company. What shall we do with him, Lizzie? We must walk out with him again, that he may not be in Bingley's way." Elizabeth could hardly help laughing at so convenient a proposal. yet was really vexed that her mother should be always giving him such an epithet. An epithet, is that a short, truthful remark or saying, a term used to characterize a person or thing? Okay, that makes sense. Comes from ancient Greek, to add on. As soon as they entered, Bingley looked at her so expressively and shook hands with such warmth as left no doubt of his good information, and he soon afterwards said aloud, "Mrs. Bennet, have you no more lanes hereabouts in which Lizzie may lose her way again today?" "I advised Mr. Darcy and Lizzie and Kitty," said Mrs. Bennet, "to walk to Oakham Mount this morning. It is a nice long walk, and Mr. Darcy has never seen the view." "It may do very well for the others," replied Mr. Bingley, "but I am sure it will be too much for Kitty. Won't it, Kitty?" Kitty owned that she would rather stay at home. Darcy professed a great curiosity to see the view from the Mount, and Elizabeth silently consented. As she went upstairs to get ready, Mrs. Bennet followed her, saying, "I am quite sorry, Lizzie, that you should be forced to have the disagreeable man all to yourself, but I hope you will not mind it. It is all for Jane's sake, you know, and there is no occasion for talking to him except just now and then, so do not put yourself to inconvenience." During their walk, it was resolved that Mr. Bennet's consent should be asked in the course of the evening. Elizabeth reserved to herself the application for her mother's. She could not determine how her mother would take it, sometimes doubting whether all his wealth and grandeur would be enough to overcome her abhorrence of the man. But whether she were violently set against the match or violently delighted with it, it was certain that her manner would be equally ill adapted to do credit to her sense, and she could no more bear that Mr. Darcy should hear the first raptures of her joy than the first vehemence of her disapprobation. I think I'm mispronouncing that. Fairly certain. Oh, from the Latin meaning eagerness or strength, an intense concentration, force or power. Vehemence. Okay. So where was I? And she could no more bear that Mr. Darcy should hear the first raptures of her joy than the first vehemence of her disapprobation. In the evening, soon after Mr. Bennet withdrew to the library, she saw Mr. Darcy rise also and follow him, and her agitation on seeing it was extreme. She did not fear her father's opposition, he was going to be made unhappy, and that it should be through her means that she, his favourite child, should be distressing him by her choice, should be filling him with fears and regrets and disposing of her, was a wretched reflection, and she sat in misery till Mr. Darcy appeared again. When looking at him, she was a little relieved by his smile. In a few minutes he approached the table where she was sitting with Kitty, and while pretending to admire her work, said in a whisper, "Go to your father. He wants you in the library." She was gone directly. Her father was walking about the room, looking grave and anxious. "Lizzie," said he, "what are you doing? Are you out of your senses to be accepting this man? Have you not always hated him?" How earnestly did she then wish that her former opinions had been more reasonable, her expressions more moderate, would have spared her from explanations and professions which it was exceedingly awkward to give, but they were now necessary, and she assured him with some confusion of her attachment to Mr. Darcy. Or in other words, you are determined to have him. He is rich, to be sure, and you may have more fine clothes and fine carriages than Jane, but will they make you happy? Have you any other objections, said Elizabeth, than your belief of my indifference? None at all. We all know him to be proud, unpleasant sort of man, but this would be nothing if you really liked him. I do like him, she replied with tears in her eyes. I love him. Indeed, he has no improper pride. He is perfectly amiable. You do not know what he really is. Then pray do not pain me by speaking of him in such terms. Lizzie, said her father, I have given him my consent. He is the kind of man, indeed, to whom I should never dare refuse anything which he condescended to ask. I now give it to you, if you are not resolved on having him. But let me advise you to think better of it. I know your disposition, Lizzie. I know that you could be neither happy nor respectable unless you truly esteemed your husband, unless you looked up to him as a superior. Your lively talents would place you in the greatest danger in an unequal marriage. You could scarcely escape discredit, misery. My child, let me not have the grief of seeing you unable to respect your partner in life. You know not what you are about. Elizabeth, still more affected, was earnest and solemn in her reply, and at length, by repeated assurances that Mr. Darcy was really the object of her choice, by explaining the gradual change which her estimation of him had undergone, relating her absolute certainty that his affection was not the work of a day, but had stood the test of many months' suspense, and enumerating with energy all his good qualities, she did conquer her father's incredulity and reconciled him to the match. Well, my dear, said he, when she ceased speaking, I've no more to say. If this is to be the case, he deserves you. I could not have parted with you, my Lizzie, to anyone less worthy. To complete the favourable impression, she then told him what Mr. Darcy had voluntarily done for Lydia. He heard her with astonishment. This is an evening of wonders indeed. And so, Darcy did everything? Made up the match, gave the money, paid the fellow's debts, and got him his commission? So much the better. It will save me a world of trouble and economy. Had it been your uncle's doing, I must and would have paid him. But these violent young lovers carry everything their own way. I shall offer to pay him tomorrow. He will rant and storm about his love for you, and there will be the end of the matter. He then recollected his embarrassment a few days before on reading Mr. Collins' letter, and after laughing at her some time, allowed her at last to go, saying as she quitted the room, If any young men come for Mary or Kitty, send them in, for I am quite at leisure. Elizabeth's mind was now relieved from a very heavy weight, and after half an hour's quiet reflection in her own room, she was able to join the others with tolerable composure. Everything was too recent for gaiety. The evening passed tranquilly away. There was no longer anything material to be dreaded, and the comfort of ease and familiarity would come in time. When her mother went up to her dressing room at night, she followed her and made the important communication. Its effect was extraordinary. From first hearing it, Mrs. Bennet was quite still and unable to utter a syllable. Nor was it under many, many minutes that she could comprehend what she heard, though not in general backwards to credit what was for the advantage of her family, or what came in the shape of a lover to any of them. She began at length to recover, to fidget about in her chair, get up, sit down, again, wonder and bless herself. Good gracious, Lord bless me, only think, dear me, Mr. Darcy, who would have thought it? And is it really true? Oh, my sweetest Lizzie, how rich and how great you will be! What pin money, what jewels, what carriages you will have! James is nothing to it, nothing at all. I'm so pleased, so happy, such a charming man, so handsome, so tall. Oh, my dear Lizzie, pray apologise for my having disliked him so much before. I hoped he will overlook it. Dear, dear Lizzie, a house in town, everything that is charming, 3 daughters married, 10,000 a year. Oh Lord, what will become of me? I shall go distracted. This was enough to prove that her approbation need not be doubted, and Elizabeth, rejoicing that such an effusion was heard only by herself, soon went away. But before she had been 3 minutes in her own room, her mother followed her. My dearest child, she cried, I can think of nothing else. 10,000 a year, and very likely more. 'Tis as good as a lord, and a special licence. You must and shall be married by special licence. But my dearest love, tell me what dish Mr. Darcy is particularly fond of, that I may have it tomorrow. And a special license. You must and shall be married by a special license. I have no idea what that is a reference to. Interesting, though. This was a sad omen of what a mother's behaviour to the gentleman himself might be, and Elizabeth found that, though in the certain possession of his warmest affection, and secure of her relations' consent, there was still something to be wished for. But the morrow passed much better than she expected, for Mrs. Bennet luckily stood in such awe of her intended son-in-law that she ventured not to speak to him, unless it was in her power to offer him any attention or mark of deference for his opinion. Elizabeth had the satisfaction of seeing her father taking pains to get acquainted with him, and Mr. Bennet soon assured her that he was rising every hour in his esteem. I admire all my three son-in-laws highly, said he. Wickham, perhaps, is my favourite, but I think I shall like your husband quite as well as Jane's. Chapter 60. Elizabeth's spirit soon rising to playfulness again, she wanted Mr. Darcy to account for his having ever fallen in love with her. How could you begin, said she. I can comprehend your going on charmingly, when you had once made a beginning, but what could set you off in the first place? I cannot fix on the hour, or the spot, or the look, or the words which laid the foundation. It is too long ago. I was in the middle before I knew I had begun. My beauty you had early withstood. And as for my manners, my behaviour to you was at least always bordering on uncivil, and I never spoke to you without rather wishing to give you pain than not. Now be sincere, did you admire me for my impertinence? For the liveliness of your mind, I did. You may as well call it impertinence at once. It was a very little less. The fact is that you were sick of civility, of deference, of officious attention. You were disgusted with the women who were always speaking and looking and thinking for your approbation alone. I roused and interested you because I was so unlike them. Had you not been really amiable, you would have hated me for it. But in spite of the pains you took to disguise yourself, your feelings were always noble and just, and in your heart you thoroughly despised the persons who so assiduously courted you. There, I have saved you the trouble of accounting for it, and really, all things considered, I begin to think it perfectly reasonable. To be sure, you knew no actual good of me, but nobody thinks of that when they fall in love. Was there no good in your affectionate behaviour to Jane while she was ill at Netherfield? Dearest Jane, who could have done less for her? But make a virtue of it by all means. My good qualities are under your protection, and you are to exaggerate them as much as possible, and in return it belongs to me to find occasions for teasing and quarrelling with you as often as may be, and I shall begin directly by asking you what made you so unwilling to come to the point at last. What made you so shy of me when you first called and afterwards dined here? Why, especially when you called, did you look as if you did not care about me? Because you were grave and silent, and gave me no encouragement. I was embarrassed, and so was I. You might have talked to me more when you came to dinner. A man who had felt less might. How unlucky that you should have a reasonable answer to give, and that I should be so reasonable as to admit it. But I wonder how long you would have gone on if you had if you had been left to yourself. I wonder when you would have spoken, if I had not asked you. My resolution of thanking you for your kindness to Lydia had certainly great effect. Too much, I am afraid, for what becomes of the moral if our comfort springs from the breach of promise? For I ought not to have mentioned the subject. This will never do. You need not distress yourself. The moral will be perfectly fair. Lady Catherine's unjustified endeavours to separate us were the means of removing all my doubts. I am not indebted for my present happiness to your eager desire of expressing your gratitude. I was not in a humour to wait for any opening of yours. My aunt's intelligence had given me hope, and I was determined at once to know everything. Lady Catherine has been of infinite use, which ought to make her happy, for she loves to be of use. But tell me, what did you come down to Netherfield for? Was it merely to ride to Longbourn and be embarrassed, or had you intended any more serious consequence? My real purpose was to see you, and to judge, if I could, whether I might ever hope to make you love me. Whether I might ever hope to make you love me. My avowed one, or what I avowed to myself, was to see whether your sister was still partial to Bingley, and if she were, to make the confession to him which I have since made. Shall you ever have courage to announce to Lady Catherine what is to befall her? I am more likely to want time than courage, Elizabeth, but it ought to be done, and if you will give me a sheet of paper, it shall be done directly. And if I had not a letter to write myself, I might sit by you and admire the evenness of your writing, as another young lady once did. But I have an aunt, too, who must not be longer neglected. From an unwillingness to confess how much her intimacy with Mr. Darcy had been overrated, Elizabeth had never yet answered Mrs. Gardiner's long letter, but now, having that to communicate, which she knew would be most welcome, she was almost ashamed to find that her uncle and aunt had already lost 3 days of happiness, and immediately wrote as follows. I would have thanked you before, my dear aunt, as I ought to have done, for your long, kind, satisfactory detail of particulars, but to say the truth, I was too cross to write. You supposed more than really existed, but now suppose as much as you choose. Give a loose rein to your fancy, indulge your imagination every possible flight which the subject will afford. Unless you believe me actually married, you cannot greatly err. You must write again very soon, and praise him a great deal more than you did in your last. I thank you again and again for not going to the lakes, for how could I be so silly as to wish it? Your idea of the ponies is delightful. We will go round the park every day. I'm the happiest creature in the world. Perhaps other people have said so before, but not one with such justice. I am happier even than Jane. She only smiles. I laugh. Mr. Darcy sends you all the love in the world that he can spare from me. You are all to come to Pemberley at Christmas. Yours, etc. Mr. Darcy's letter to Lady Catherine was in a different style, and still different from either was that Mr. Bennet sent to Mr. Collins in reply to his last. Dear Sir, I must trouble you once more for congratulations. Elizabeth will soon be the wife of Mr. Darcy. Console Lady Catherine as well you can. But if I were you, I would stand by the nephew. He has more to give. Yours sincerely, etc. In a time when the letters were expensive to send, so people would tend to write all the way up to the margins and would often cross-write. So they would write in one direction horizontally, then turn the paper over and write in the other direction, and so on. In an age such as this, that is a remarkably terse letter. Miss Bingley's congratulations to her brother on his approaching marriage were all that was affectionate and insincere. She wrote even to Jane on the occasion to express her delight and repeat all her former professions of regard. Jane was not deceived, but she was affected, and though feeling no reliance on her, could not help writing her a much kinder answer than she knew was deserved. The joy which Miss Darcy expressed on receiving similar information was as sincere as her brother's in sending it. 4 sides of paper were insufficient to contain all her delight, and all her earnest desire of being loved by her sister. Before any answer could arrive from Mr. Collins, or any congratulations to Elizabeth from his wife, the Longbourn family heard that the Collinses would come themselves to Lucas Lodge. The reason of this sudden removal was soon evident. Lady Catherine had been rendered so exceedingly angry by the contents of her nephew's letter that Charlotte, really rejoicing in the match, was anxious to get away till the storm was blown over. At such a moment, the arrival of her friend was a sincere pleasure to Elizabeth, though in the course of their meeting she must sometimes think the pleasure dearly bought when she saw Mr. Darcy exposed to all the pandering and obsequious civility of her husband. Obsequious. Compliant with someone else's orders or wishes, excessively eager and attentive to please or to obey instructions. He bore it, however, with admirable calmness. He could even listen to Sir William Lucas when he complimented him on carrying away the brightest jewel of the country, and expressed his hopes of their all meeting frequently at St. James with very decent composure. If he did not shrug his shoulders, it was not till Sir William was out of sight. If he did shrug his shoulders, it was not till Sir William was out of sight. That's interesting. Because I would consider shrugging shoulders as either an indicator of indifference, e.g. I don't care either way, or of confusion, e.g. I don't know whether that's true. So I wonder what the significance of him shrugging his shoulders when Sir William was out of sight is. Mrs. Phillips's vulgarity was another, and perhaps a greater tax on his forbearance. And though Mrs. Phillips, as well as her sister, stood in too much awe of him to speak with the familiarity which Bingley's good humour encouraged, yet, whenever she did speak, she must be vulgar. Nor was her respect for him, though it made her more quiet, at all likely to make her more elegant. Elizabeth did all she could to shield him from the frequent notice of either, and was ever anxious to keep him to herself, and to those of her family with whom he might converse without mortification. And though the uncomfortable feelings arising from all this took from the season of courtship much of its pleasure, it added to the hope of the future, which looked forward with delight to the time when they should be removed from society, so little pleasing to either, to all the comfort and elegance of their family party at Pemberley. Okay, there's one chapter left, so we will conclude that now. Chapter 61. Happy for all her maternal feelings was the day on which Mrs. Bennet got rid of her two most deserving daughters. With what delighted pride she afterwards visited Mrs. Bingley and talked of Mrs. Darcy may be guessed. I wish I could say, for the sake of her family, that the accomplishment of her earnest desire in the establishment of so many of her children produced so happy an effect as to make her a sensible, amiable, well-informed woman for the rest of her life, though perhaps it was lucky for her husband, who might not have relished domestic felicity in so unusual a form, that she still was occasionally nervous and invariably silly. Mr. Bennet missed his second daughter exceedingly. His affection for her drew him oftener from home than anything else could do. He delighted in going to Pemberley, especially when he was least expected. Mr. Bingley and Jane remained at Netherfield only a 12-month. So near a vicinity to her mother and Meryton relations was not desirable even to his easy temper or her affectionate heart. The darling wish of his sisters was then gratified. He bought an estate in a neighbouring county to Derbyshire, and Jane and Elizabeth, in addition to every other source of happiness, were within 30 miles of each other. Kitty, to her very material advantage, spent the chief of her time with her two elder sisters. In society so superior to what she had generally known, her improvement was great. She was not of so ungovernable a temper as Lydia, and removed from the influence of Lydia's example, she became, by proper attention and management, less irritable, less ignorant, and less insipid. From the further disadvantage of Lydia's society she was of course carefully kept, and though Mrs. Wickham frequently invited her to come and stay with her, with the promise of balls and young men, her father would never consent to her going. Mary was the only daughter who remained at home, and she was necessarily drawn from the pursuit of accomplishments by Mrs. Bennet's being quite unable to sit alone. Mary was obliged to mix more with the world, but she could still moralise over every morning visit, and as she was no longer mortified by comparisons between her sister's beauty and her own, it was suspected by her father that she submitted to the change without much reluctance. As for Wickham and Lydia, their characters suffered no revolution from the marriage of her sisters. He bore with philosophy the conviction that Elizabeth must now become acquainted with whatever of his ingratitude and falsehood had before been unknown to her, and in spite of everything, was not wholly without hope that Darcy might yet be prevailed on to make his fortune. The congratulatory letter which Elizabeth received from Lydia on her marriage explained to her that, by his wife at least, if not by himself, such a hope was cherished. The letter was to this effect: my dear Lizzie, I wish you joy. If you love Mr. Darcy half as well as I do my dear Wickham, you must be very happy. It is a great comfort to have you so rich, and when you have nothing else to do, hope you will think of us. I am sure Wickham would like a place at court very much. I do not think we shall have quite money enough to live upon without some help. Any place would do, of about 300 or 400 a year. But however, do not speak to Mr. Darcy about it, if you had rather not. Yours, etc. As it happened that Elizabeth had much rather not, she endeavoured in her answer to put an end to every entreaty and expectation of the kind. Such relief, however, as it was in her power to afford, by the practice of what might be called economy in her own private expenses, she frequently sent them. It had always been evident to her that such an income as theirs, under the direction of two persons so extravagant in their wants and heedless of the future, must be very insufficient to their support. Whenever they changed their quarters, either Jane or herself was sure of being applied to for some little assistance towards discharging their bills. The manner of living, even when the restoration of peace dismissed them to a home, was unsettled in the extreme. They were always moving from place to place in a quest of a cheap situation, and always spending more than they ought. His affection for her soon sunk into indifference. Hers lasted a little longer, and in spite of her youth and manners, she retained all the claims to reputation which her marriage had given her. Though Darcy could never receive him at Pemberley, yet for Elizabeth's sake he assisted him further in his profession. Lydia was occasionally a visitor there, when her husband was gone to enjoy himself in London or Bath, and with the Bingleys they both of them frequently stayed so long that even Bingley's good humour was overcome, and he proceeded so far as to talk of giving them a hint to be gone. Miss Bingley was very deeply mortified by Darcy's marriage, but as she thought it advisable to retain the right of visiting at Pemberley, she dropped all her resentment, was fonder than ever of Georgina, almost as attentive to Darcy as theretofore, and paid off every arrear of civility to Elizabeth. Pemberley was now Georgina's home, and the attachment of the sisters was exactly what Darcy had hoped to see. They were able to love each other even as well as they intended. Georgina had the highest opinion in the world of Elizabeth, though at first she often listened with an astonishment bordering on alarm at her lively, sportive manner of talking to her brother. He, who had always inspired in herself a respect which almost overcame her affection, she now saw the object of open pleasantry. Her mind received knowledge which had never before fallen in her way. By Elizabeth's instruction, she began to comprehend that a woman may take liberties with her husband, which a brother will not always allow in a sister more than 10 years younger than himself. Lady Catherine was extremely indignant on the marriage of her nephew, and as she gave way to all the genuine frankness of her character in her reply to the letter which announced its arrangement, she sent him language so very abusive, especially of Elizabeth, that for some time all intercourse was at an end. But at length, by Elizabeth's persuasion, he was prevailed on to overlook the offence and seek a reconciliation, and after a little further resistance on the part of his aunt, her resentment gave way, either to her affection for him or her curiosity to see how his wife conducted herself, and she condescended to wait on them at Pemberley, in spite of that pollution which its woods had received, not merely from the presence of such a mistress, but the visits of her uncle and aunt from the city. With the Gardiners they were always on the most intimate terms. Darcy, as well as Elizabeth, really loved them, and they were both ever sensible of the warmest gratitude towards the persons who, by bringing her into Derbyshire, had been the means of uniting them. So that's it. That's the end of Pride and Prejudice. I rather enjoyed it. Enjoyed it more than I thought I would, I think. Not sure what we're going to read next. That is starting next Wednesday. I am half tempted to read through another Jane Austen novel. since this one seemed so agreeable. But there is also an argument towards having more variety, so I'm not sure. I'll think on it in the interim. So, riddles for this week. So I believe last week we ended on riddle 90, which is as follows. We are fresh, young and fair, and twins you may swear, for never did sisters agree, since the world did begin, in shape, size and mien, in features and fortunes as we. To give us our due, we've been constant and true, through all chances and changes of weather, many dangers we passed, though now parted at last, to maintain no more commerce together. Both alike to be seen, with our backs dressed in green, on two opposite planes we abide, as close prisoners confined, while the gay feathered kind fly round us on every side. As they fly through the air, by the mirth they make there, you'd suppose they no mischief intend us, but to our great surprise, they all peck at our eyes, and we have but one couple between us. Though for these we regard, yet our fate is so hard, that our beauty can make no resistance, and the wounds they leave there, and our faces appear like the spots in the moon at a distance. But what we can't cure, we with patience endure, and will keep you no more in the dark. For by this borrowed light, you'll take your own right, and fair ladies, you can't miss your mark. The solution to that riddle, rather perplexingly, was butts. I still don't comprehend it. My best guess is that perhaps butts is a shortening of buttresses or something like that, and it's a structure in a birdhouse or something of that ilk. I am speculating considerably. Not that a convention, not that you would have real buttresses for a birdhouse, but you know, that's the only way it sort of makes sense. Some sort of etymology like that. I just don't know. Anyway, that is what it is. Let's move on to 91. When tempests deform the smooth face of the sky, or winter neglected and naked I lie, but soon as approaches the beautiful May, in the fields and the meadows and nature looks gay, 'tis then I step forth, a la mode, like the fair, with my long silken train, and all plaited my hair. When thus I am adorned and dressed in my fly, oh, ye gods, what a beautiful creature am I! Of an object so striking, ye gazers beware, come not within reach of so fatal a snare. For the malice prepense, and a desperate will, I'm bent to destroy and determined to kill. Interesting. A la mode, fashionable in the current style or fashion. Unadapted borrowing from French a la mode, in fashion. pence, devised or contrived or planned beforehand, preconceived, premeditated. I assume that's pence in the same sense as in pensive, as in to think. So previously thought about, I would assume. Dressed in my fly is interesting. I think it's clear it's being used as a noun in that sense. Historical type of small light fast horse-drawn carriage that can be hired for transportation. Seems unlikely. The pair of arms revolving around the bobbin in a spinning wheel or spinning frame to twist the yarn. Again, unlikely. A shuttle driven through the shed by a blow or jerk. Again, unlikely. The person who took the printed sheets from the press. Unlikely. Vibrating frame with fingers attached to a power printing press for doing the same work. Again, unlikely. One of the upper screens of a stage in theatre. Unlikely. Ooh. No. It wouldn't be that. A wing? Unlikely. Yep, so I don't know what that means. It could be a type of bird, though. Because there are plenty of birds whose... or what's the term? Their plumage will change depending upon the season. And plenty of birds which hunt. So with my long silken train and all plaited my hair could be an allusion to what happened... an allusion to what their plumage does during May. And dressed in my fly, there's a slim chance that could be a reference to their wings. Although, if that were how the language was being used, surely that would have made this riddle trivial to someone in the to the intended audience. I don't know, I'm gonna have to look it up. The best I can say is there's a chance it's some sort of animal who changes in appearance over the year and is carnivorous. But that's just my guesswork. A fishing rod. Okay, that makes more sense. Let's have a look again, shall we? When tempests upon the smooth face of the sky, all winter neglected and naked I lie. Oh, because they're not using the fishing rod. Okay, but as soon as approaches a beautiful May, when the fields and the meadows and nature looks gay, 'tis then I step forth on a mode like the fair, because it's fashionable in May to go fishing, it would appear, with my long silken train, so that's the silken line, and all plaited my hair. I don't know what that would be a reference to. Possibly a fly? I wasn't aware that fly fishing was that old though. When thus I'm adorned and dressed in my fly, I suppose it is. Oh ye gods, what a beautiful creature am I! Of an object so striking, ye gazers beware, come not within reach of so fatal a snare. For with malice prepense and desperate will, I'm bent to destroy and determined to kill. So that's a warning to fish, not to people. Okay, it did exist. The 18th century was mainly an era of consolidation of the techniques developed in the previous century. Running rings began to appear along the fishing rods, which gave anglers greater control over the cast line. The rods themselves were also becoming increasingly sophisticated and specialized for different roles. Jointed rods became common from the middle of the century, and bamboo came to be used for the top section of the rod, giving it a much greater strength and flexibility. And this is the page for fly fishing, so it's reasonable to assume this is specifically fishing with a fly. So okay, yeah, it's much more ancient than I thought it was. Interesting. Well, with that additional context, I think this is actually a rather good riddle. So 92. TYD to conditions, hard and close immured. Too many turns and various shifts inured. A fair recluse, the busy world I shun. Seldom like you fair, my man undone. Inferiors spurn, superiors me oppress. I bear it all, not subject to redress. In open daylight, hardly ever remain. Just peep abroad and hide myself again. Fretted with hype, in state dependent placed, in gloomy station ever bound to waste. This is a tough one. Right. Inure is to cause someone to become accustomed to something that requires prolonged or repeated tolerance, or one or more unpleasantries from practice or exercise. Interesting. Searching for Emmer, I only found a quote on Wiktionary for vagabondical. He was an intricate prognosticator of firmamental eclipses and vaticinated future occurrence by the mysterious influence of the sublime stars and vagabondical planets. Generated he was by the inhuman conjunction of an incubus, and was immured alive in a cave by preeminent magic of the Lady of the Lake. What is immur a shortening of? Hold on, there's a simple tactic to take here. I have my physical dictionary. All we do is we look up IMMUR and see what turns up. Immure. IMMURE. Imprison. Shut oneself up. Hence immurement. Ah, didn't know that. I'm still not 100% sure what TY apostrophe D is. I guess I could try the same tactic. But since it's only 2 letters, this may be more difficult. Yeah. There's quite a few words that begin with TY. quite a few, but not a vast number. It could be tide, of course. Although that would be spelt differently in modern English, wouldn't it? Because tying is Tying, but tide is Tied. But they might have spelt it differently back then. Tyrannicide seems unlikely. Well, that's a noun. Tyrannize, again, unlikely. Typify, unlikely. Yeah, so tide is the best guess I have. Although then why would it be capitalised like that? It makes no sense. Tied to conditions, hard and close imprisoned, to many turns and various shifts accustomed. A fair recluse, the busy world I shun, seldom like you, ye fair, by man undone. Inferiors spurn, superiors me oppress, I bear it all, not subject to redress. In open daylight, hardly ever remain, just peep abroad and hide myself again, fretted with hype, in state dependent placed. Although I don't know what they would mean by hype. HYP. Hypochondria. Hypnotism. Hypnotist. A hypotenuse. Oh, hypotenuse. I do apologise. A hypotenuse. Verb, to make melancholy. Fretted with hype, in state dependent placed, in gloomy station ever bound to waste. Hello, Sigourn. How are you? I must confess, I think I'm probably defeated by this one. And yes, you're absolutely right about the capitalisation of the first word. but I can't for the life of me figure out what it is. Wait, as you say, it's like in the second one. Are they just capitalising? They are capitalising the first words. Yes. Very, very well spotted. Okay, so the capitalisation isn't significant. So I wonder if it is just an archaic spelling of tide, then. Parts of this make me think the moon, but the moon is not walled off or spurned by inferiors. No. Seldom Like You by Man Undone. So I assume that would mean that the answer to the riddle, and the reader are both seldom undone by man. So perhaps this could be something knotted? Sadly, I think I'm about ready to give up and look it up. If you'd like to make a guess, by all means. I'm probably going to look it up and then move on to the next and final riddle of this stream. It is a shame, but obviously sometimes I really don't know. And especially with these being old, sometimes there's just essential context I don't have. Stays! Oh, okay, as in the item of clothing that a woman would have worn. Ah, okay. Tied to conditions, hard and close, immured, meaning imprisoned. To many turns and various shifts, inured, so accustomed to. Well, again, that makes sense. A fair recluse, a busy would I shun, seldom like you fair, by man undone. Okay, so rarely would a man undo a stay. Is what they're saying. I mean, the closest equivalent today would be a bra, although it's not quite the same item of clothing. Inferiors spurn, superiors me oppress. Yeah, I'm not sure what that's a reference to. I bear it all, not subject to redress. In open daylight, hardly ever remain. Just peep abroad and hide myself again. That makes sense. Fretted with hype, and I'm still not sure what that means. In state dependent placed, in gloomy station ever bound to waste. Okay, I really think I would have struggled anyway, but it makes a bit more sense in retrospect. Wikipedia doesn't seem to have an article for stays specifically, but in History of Corsets it has a picture of a silk plain weave stay. So I'm not an expert. I understand they are distinct items of clothing to a corset, but they are related. Anyway. So, 93 and the last one of the stream. In a room big enough to work or to play, a carpet was spread over a parcel of hay, and of neat country dances 12 couple went on. Now perhaps you expect both a jig and a sonnet. But alas, among these there was none to be seen that could whistle Mull Musk or the sweet Indian Queen. Near these, a great group of smart lads in their natures stood like so many posts or indifferent spectators, and no wonder what none of them joined in the jig, for it seems they were every one tied by the leg. And no wonder that none of the former could sing, for they every one danced with their neck in a string. Could they be marionettes? Let me read it again. In a room big enough to work or to play, a carpet was spread over a parcel of hay. That seems like something which, if you lived in the times, that may be very meaningful to you, but to me it doesn't mean much. And of neat country dances 12 couple went on. Now perhaps you expect both a jig and a sonnet, but alas, among these there were none to be seen that could whistle Mull Musk or the sweet Indian Queen. Near these a great group of smart lads in their natures stood like so many posts or indifferent spectators, and no wonder that none of them joined in the jig, for it seems they were every one tied by the leg. And no wonder that none of the former could sing, for they every one danced with their neck in a string. I think marionettes. That's my best guess. Would anyone in chat like to make a guess? Either the same or different? I'll look it up. A lace cushion. I suppose that could be a design that's been embroidered onto a lace cushion. Unfortunately, a lot of these older riddles can be very hit or miss. Sometimes they make perfect sense and they still sound quite... and they still seem quite beautifully put together. And other times they're like that and it's just... I just don't have the context. Never mind though. It's still interesting. So, my apologies are gone, but I'm afraid I was just reaching the end of my stream. I do these streams every Wednesday. We begin with an hour of poetry, followed by an hour reading through a novel. I've just finished Pride and Prejudice today. I haven't decided what the next novel is going to be next. What the next novel will be. I'm tempted towards possibly more Jane Austen, but I'm still on the fence. And then I usually finish with about half an hour of riddles. My next stream will be on Friday, in which I will be doing some more Riven, the sequel to Mist. And Saturday's stream, if it goes ahead... Sagon says, going towards Halloween, Frankenstein is public domain. That is a good shout. That is a really good shout, actually. I will seriously consider that. Thank you for the suggestion. Where was I? Friday stream Riven. Saturday, if it goes ahead, more Riven, unless I've completed the game by then. I don't know how much is left. Monday stream is again another gaming stream, which may be more Riven if I still haven't finished it, or it may be something else. I am in a bit of a awkward position because I really want to play the new Monkey Island game when it comes out, and I believe that comes out on Monday the 19th. And I'm getting right to the end of Riven, and I feel as though I'm probably going to end up having a few streams in between, which aren't long enough for me to start the sequel to Riven, which I do want to do, but which aren't really long enough to do a full game, so I'm going to have to figure out what that is. But the long and the short of it is I stream on Mondays with some sort of game, Wednesdays poetry, prose and riddles, Fridays some sort of game, and Saturdays, when those streams go ahead, which is most of the time but not all the time, I do some sort of game. So, thank you for coming, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the stream. And thank you very much again for your suggestion, Sigourn. I hope everyone has a wonderful night. And good night.